Hello, are you studying for your state property casualty insurance test, either general lines or personal lines? Are you learning about the terms open perils and named perils, what we call the cause of loss forms? Well, in today's video, we're going to cover those important terms, go through and make sure you understand them so you'll be ready to pass that test. Be sure to stick around till the end, and we'll go over a practice question to get you ready to pass that state test. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome back. So these terms that we're going to cover in this video, which is what's called the cause of loss forms, that's the named perils and the open perils, are very fundamental for you being able to pass the property casualty tests. Also, what goes along with this, and you'll see this in one of our other videos, I'm going to reference that right up there, is what's called loss valuation. Replacement value, actual cash value, agreed value. Now, understanding those two main components will help you understand how the policies work. In fact, if you understand those basics, what we're going to cover here, and we're covering in that other video on the loss valuation forms, that'll pretty much set you on the right path to be able to answer most of the questions that you're going to get on things like homeowners policies, auto policies, business policies, and the like. Because understanding for each of these policies, what are the cause of loss forms and what are the loss valuations are a main point of the questions that you're going to get on the test. But as I said, we're going to focus on what we call the cause of loss forms. So let's go ahead and jump into that. Now, the first thing we're going to cover here is a definition. Now, this is the definition of what is called a proximate cause of loss. The term proximate cause of loss means the first cause of loss, and it is the first event in a daisy chain that causes the loss, and in general, the cause of loss must be a covered cause of loss. Now, what does that mean? Here's an example. It says if an earthquake breaks a gas main that results in a fire that destroys a building, the proximate cause of loss for the building is the earthquake. Now, while the intermediate cause of loss is the fire, the building is covered only if earthquake is covered under that policy. The proximate or the first cause of loss really needs to be the thing that is covered, and if the daisy chain of events after that happen, then those things are then subsequently going to be covered. Now, there's an exception to that called an ensuing loss, which we'll get into in another video. Now let's get into these particular cause of loss forms. Now there's two of them on here. We have named perils and we have open perils. And the name really tells you what it is. And you're going to see that a lot when we cover this material, that the name really tells you what it is. So let's start, of course, with named peril, the first of the cause of loss forms. Now, named peril means simply that if that particular peril, that bad thing that causes the loss, is on this list, then it's covered. If it's on the list, it's covered. If it's not on the list, it's not covered. A policy that uses named perils or specified perils is only going to cover those items that are on the list. One of the really important points here is that with a named peril policy, it is the policy owner that has the burden of proving the loss. In other words, if the policy owner can prove that the insured property was damaged by a specified peril, then the insurance company is obligated to pay the claim. But an important point here, like I said, is who has the burden. And in this case, with named perils, it is the policy owner that has the burden. Now, what items are on the list? Well, let's take a look at a list of some typical items that are on the named peril list. Now, it's important to understand that this is not the list. There's a list in every policy. Every policy is going to have a different list. This is representative of the types of things that you'll see. For example, in a homeowner's policy or a business policy, these are the types of things that would be covered. But don't think that this is the list. It can change. But the types of things that are on the list in a named basic peril policy are going to be the things that you would expect to be covered in the event something bad happened to, for example, your home. So let me read through the list. What's on the list is what? Fire, lightning, explosion, windstorm or hail, smoke, riot or civil commotion, vandalism, sprinkler leakage, sinkhole collapse, volcanic activity, and we'll summarize this and call this mold. Now let me clarify a few of these because they might not be really crystal clear for you. Fire and lightning, I think, are really kind of expected. You would expect if your house burns down, even the most basic policy is going to cover that. So it would. A name basic policy would cover that. Windstorm and hail. Some states, however, for example, Florida, windstorm is a separate coverage. So once again, the list can vary from policy to policy and from state to state. Now, smoke, what is that? Well, smoke would be damage from the smoke from a fire in one part of your house causing smoke damage in another part of your house. For example, you have a fire in the kitchen. The smoke gets all through the house. Well, your clothing, your bedding, you're never going to get that smell out. So in this case, the policy will cover replacing the bedding, replacing the clothing that was damaged by the smoke, although not directly damaged by the fire. Riot and civil commotion would be typically a theft or vandalism loss directly connected with that. Vandalism added separately, once again, varies from policy to policy. Now, sprinkler damage, what is that? Well, that's not the sprinklers in your yard. In a lot of commercial buildings and in some residences, you can have those fire sprinklers that are up in the ceiling. And of course, if those leak, that's a major problem. Sinkhole, volcano, I think is self-explanatory. And fungus, wet rot, dry rot, that all includes mold. And those also have some special coverages, once again, depending on your state. Now, this list, once again, not the list, but representative of what you might see in a named basic policy. Then there's the named broad policy. And what the broad list does is it adds on 4 more items, although, once again, can vary from policy to policy. Typical homeowner's policy, it'd be 6 or 7 items that are added on. But these are the main 4 that would be added on with broad. Now, although I wouldn't really recommend that you memorize the basic list, it kind of makes sense. This broad list you need to memorize so that you can tell whether they're talking about name basic or name broad. And the 4 items are falling objects, weight of ice, sleet, or snow, collapse, or water damage. But let me give you an easy way to remember these things. Now, the way our memories work is not with words really, but with pictures, which was why I have a lot of B-roll. So we have those pictures in our mind to help you remember some of those things when you're taking the test. So let me help you paint a picture. So picture a warehouse in the Midwest somewhere. And in this warehouse, it starts to snow. And snow is what? Snow is falling. Snow is falling. Snow is falling. In fact, the snow builds up on the roof until the snow gets so heavy that the roof collapses. And the roof collapsing bursts the pipe and causes water damage. Can you picture that in your mind? The 4 items are what? The snow is falling, so that represents the falling objects. The weight of ice, sleet, or snow represents the snow building up on the roof. The roof collapsing, well, it's collapse from certain causes, like, for example, weight of ice, sleet, or snow. And water damage only under certain circumstances, but close enough for you to remember those 4 items that would be added to the basic list to make it now named broad. Then we go on to the open perils. So now, instead of memorizing things that are covered, we need to what? We need to remember the things that are not covered. Because what? Because with open perils, it covers everything except for what's on the exclusion list. Another name for open perils is special perils or all risks. And you can see either of those names, special perils or all risk, instead of open perils on the test. An important point to point out here. Remember we talked about with the name perils that the burden was on the what? Was on the policy owner to prove that it was on the names list. Well, with open perils, now the burden is on the insurer to show that it was on the excluded list. And that makes a big difference, because if the insurer cannot prove that the cause of loss was on that excluded list, then they have to pay the claim. And that difference of policy owner having the burden versus the insurance company or insurer having the burden is a big deal when you're trying to get a claim paid. That's why, as we'll see when we start talking about the different policies, that the open peril policies are more expensive. They cover a lot more things, but you also have that key point of who has the burden, policy owner or the insurer. So now let's talk about the open peril exclusions. Once again, like I talked about with that names list, this isn't the exhaustive list. In other words, the list can change quite a bit from policy to policy. This is kind of a representative list. The first three items are things that are never ever covered on the policy. That would be war and military action, nuclear hazards, and wear and tear. Those three items, the insurance companies just don't cover. Now, the next three are things that you can get covered if you want to, but you have to buy a separate policy. So that means that the typical policy does not cover these things. It excludes those things so that they're what? They're covered under the additional coverage that you would buy separately. And that would include earthquake, flood, and employee dishonesty. Now let's take a look at a question and see how a question might look on the state test. Here's the question. Which of the following is commonly listed as an excluded cause of loss in an open perils policy? Well, we're going to think about what's excluded versus what's covered. Excluded means it's not covered. So let's work through and eliminate the answers like we have so many times in the past, right? So vandalism, is that covered? Well, we saw vandalism would be on a named peril list. Would it be covered under open perils? The answer is absolutely, because it's not what? It's not excluded. Explosion, also we saw that on that list. For named perils, it would not be excluded. Flood, however, as we mentioned, flood requires a what? A separate policy. That would be excluded. And windstorm was once again on that list of named basic perils. So these things are going to be covered. The item that would be excluded here is flood. Now, flood, once again, can be covered if you have that separate policy, but your typical policy, like a homeowner's policy, would exclude flood. Interestingly, though, your personal auto policy does include flood. So the correct answer here is flood. Well, that wraps up that concept. I hope you got some value out of that. If you did, please hit the like button. And if you'd like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and please check out mortonschools.com. There we have classes for pre-licensing and continuing education for every state and union, and we have courses for property casualty, life and health, adjusters in some states, and all of these securities classes. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in the next one.